Well, thank you so much, Craig, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 90-second guest, Craig Minassian. It's a pleasure having you on. You're the Chief Content Communications and Marketing Officer for the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative. So I look forward to talking to you today about relationship building and team environment. Craig, when you think of relationship building and team environment, what does it mean to you, and what has it meant for your professional career?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Delighted to be here and talk about the work of the foundation and the Clintons and the Clinton Global Initiative. I've been fortunate enough in my career, both on the creative side at HBO and working for organizations at the top of their field, and for the Clintons, both in their political lives as candidates in the White House for the president, and now with their work for the foundation, where relationship building is key. If you're on politics and you're asking for somebody's vote, you need to establish a relationship with the voter. If you're in the business world, obviously you're building a relationship with your customer. At HBO, that was a whole range of relationships, from the creative talent that we worked with to the audience. And so I've seen from the best how strong relationship building is a key to success. And for me, I think the things that I've learned from that are how to listen, how to build trust, how to and mutual respect, and very much how to appreciate somebody else's point of view. Not come into relationships assuming you know all the answers, or that the people you're having a relationship with don't know the answers. We can always learn a lot from each other, and very much that starts by listening. So those are some of the keys I've seen throughout my career.
Absolutely. And given the fact that you were the assistant press secretary and director of television news for the Clinton Gore White House, I mean, you have that history of working for the Clinton White House. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, before the transition to the George W. Bush years, we were still enjoying in this country the ability for both sides to work together, and that there was less division then than there is now. And division in this country, we've seen periods of division in this country throughout the history of the United States, for the nearly 250 years. I mean, when it was trying to become our own country and break away from the King of England and gain our own independence, I mean, we saw a division during the Civil War, and thank goodness the Union prevailed over the Confederacy. I mean, we saw a division even trying to figure out a way through the civil rights movement, and thankfully the civil rights movement prevailed, and we've been able to truly enjoy liberties and freedoms, and see our democracy in the best light, and be that shining city of the hill that we've been for nearly 250 years. But that doesn't mean that we haven't gone through our rough patches. We've been trying to always perfect our union. So my question to you is, having been a representative of President Clinton's administration, to know that 25 years later, we are going through really unparalleled division in our country for quite some time compared to yesteryear. And so, from your perspective, and this is the Relationship Building and Team Environment podcast, what has the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, how has relationship building been really the core of those two entities, where they have done their very best as separate but also organizations that work in tandem because it's under one umbrella? How have they quelled division as best as they possibly can?
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point about the '90s and about President Clinton, and it started with, at least in our approach, which has carried forward to the foundation, is when he was elected president. Obviously, there were people who didn't vote for him, but he very much made it clear, and hopefully clear to the nation, that he was there to work for everybody, regardless if you voted for him or not. And so his policies largely were designed to benefit the most people possible, and that, I think, was perhaps more possible than it is now. And obviously, I think both President Bush and President Obama and President Biden all had that same approach. I think one thing that is different now is social media. It's not surprising. There, as you talked about, there's always been a lot of division in our country. Some of it perhaps even worse than we're seeing now in terms of the catastrophic results we saw through different groups who were really, pushed out of mainstream society by groups that didn't want them there. But what the antidote was actually getting to know people as people. And so whether that was in the workplace, whether that was in schools and the importance of integrated schools, whether it was simply meeting people out in the world, there wasn't this intermediary of social media that let you exist in your own silo. That's not an original thought. There's obviously been plenty of studies about that. So, in a certain sense, some of the division we see today can feel worse, can seem worse. And obviously, there's a recency bias because we're experiencing ourselves, but we shouldn't both discount the kind of division that America has had before, but also we shouldn't discount the fact that America's ability to get through that division as well. And so there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful that if there's a will, there's a way in terms of getting through the current situation. Well, and when that comes to the foundation, again, as the president's goal is we should work for all people. That's certainly the foundation's goal. Our tagline is actually taken from the 92 campaign of putting people first. And we try to keep that in mind for all the work that we do. And because so much of the work is built on partnerships, particularly the Clinton Global Initiative, in our perfect model, the government, and not just the US government, governments broadly, local, state, international, other countries, other cities, would work with the corporate sector and the NGO and philanthropic sector to tackle problems. And the president will often say, the whole where the foundation fits in is we fill that gap between what the public sector can provide and what the private sector can produce and deliver ideas and projects and aid and needs that fill that gap. When President Clinton started CGI, he would go to a lot of very good, very well meaning conferences, the World Economic Forum and others. And he just felt that there was a missed opportunity, that a lot of incredible people from all different sectors were talking about great ideas, what we could do to improve global health, how we could tackle climate change. And they just weren't being asked to do anything with those ideas. And so what he started with CGI was that same kind of put all these people in the room, let's hear those ideas, and then encourage them to do something with those ideas, to turn those ideas into action. And in our parlance, we call those commitments. People and organizations would come to CGI, they'll partner on a solution to a problem, have a very measurable approach to doing it, and that new plan is called a commitment. And now, almost 4,100 commitments later, these commitments are working in 180 countries, helping more than 500 million people all around the world in every way, shape, or form you can imagine. And to answer your question about division, I think when people see other people from different sectors and different walks of life and different experiences working together for a common good, that is a tremendous way to overcome division because it shows that people care about each other. And it shows that, you want to establish a relationship with someone. And we found a lot of eager reception to that approach and thankfully a lot of impact.
And I'm so glad that you are a hopeful optimist, and I am too. And you point out that the division is really bad. I mean, it's palpable. I mean, you could feel it from an environmental standpoint, just from a visceral standpoint. You could feel around you the division. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you could visibly see, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be through what people are saying or what people are doing. I mean, just their presence alone, you can tell that people are stressed. You can tell people are anxious, especially with this government shutdown. What happened even 5 years ago with COVID-19, the pandemic, what the 2020 election signified in terms of, President Trump, who lost the election, but then he was sowing doubt in our institutions and sowing doubt in typical regular political discourse and making people fearful of the future, making people fearful that the election was stolen or that the election was rigged. And that's how January 6th happened. But even before that, when President Trump came into office and it was post Obama years, it really tapped into a segment of the population where even President Clinton and Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary Clinton, when she had lost that very close election. I don't believe that it was so much as, yes, maybe there were blue states that Secretary Clinton could have campaigned in more, or maybe the messaging was more toward, Washington D.C. elite or the Democratic strongholds, the bastions on both coasts or in populated cities. But because President Clinton and therefore former First Lady Clinton, who then became U.S. Senator, and then Secretary Clinton, she and President Clinton always, based their focus on the working class and the people who identify with the Democratic Party. And I just think that if she would have became president, I believe that the working class, or what people who are not the Ivy League or typical elite class, let's say, but people who are maybe not, 4-year educated, but maybe they went to a great trade school. Maybe they have professions where they are considered to be small business owners and or entrepreneurs, or people who work in the farms, or people who work in the factories. I do believe that they were going to have a voice in a Hillary Clinton administration. And therefore, I think that the rise of President Trump would never have happened if the people who voted for him weren't misled or misguided, thinking that President Trump was the answer, because he turned out to be not. We gave a $2 trillion tax cut to the ultra wealthy and the millionaires and billionaires. And now we see with the big, beautiful bill, $3.4 trillion is going to add to our national debt. And it really doesn't take care of the people who are trying to survive. It doesn't take care of the people who are, trying to make rent, trying to put food on the table, trying to get their kids through school, trying to afford healthcare, and trying to have a better quality of life. And I just think that, not to be a revisionist or not to look just to the past, because we can learn from the past, but it's all about moving forward and looking forward. But I do believe that if Hillary Clinton was president, she would have continued on, just like her husband, she would have continued on making sure that the working class and all Americans would have a fair shot, just like President Biden, just like President Obama, even George W. Bush to an extent, who does believe in diversity, does believe in pro-immigration. Obviously, everybody wants legalized immigration, and we need comprehensive immigration reform, and that's a whole nother topic that we could definitely discuss on this podcast. But I think that for the wrong reasons, President Trump was elected. And I think that for the wrong reasons, he was reelected for a second term, non-consecutive terms, first time since Grover Cleveland. But I would love your thoughts on, when Secretary Clinton didn't win the election, how much of that affected the outcome or the vision even 10 years ago, now fast forward 10 years later, of the Clinton Global Initiative or the Clinton Foundation? How much of that election, played a part in all of that?
I think there are two answers to that. There's always been a through line of service and public service. As I mentioned, our tagline is putting people first, and that we adopted from the 92 campaign, but was always his mantra going back to being governor and attorney general and serving the people of Arkansas. And so that fueled an approach to their campaigns, to their time in office, for the president when he was president, or secretary when she was the senator from New York, and Chelsea in her own work, particularly in the public health realm. So that didn't change. The outcome of the 2016 election was personally disappointing for all of us who've worked for the Clintons for a long time and really thought that she would make a great president. But in many cases, it just reinforced that we needed to channel our efforts into continuing to try to put people first and do that through the foundation. So I don't think there was a reaction as much as a continuity, and to their great credit and her great credit, she obviously was a terrible disappointment not to win, but she decided to rededicate herself in so many different ways that she has, including through the foundation, to continue why she wanted to be president in the first place. And I have, such a tremendous admiration for her and the family for doing that.
And do you feel that from the Clinton years, and one of my questions that I always ask my guests are, who are your early role models? Who are your mentors? Who are people you looked up to and admired, leaders who you wanted to emulate? And you don't have to personally look any further than President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, who have been extraordinary, lifelong public servants, who have done so much for our nation, who have done so much for American families, have done so much for preserving our democracy and abiding by and upholding the Constitution and being ambassadors, not only as a president who essentially is the ambassador of the United States in a sense, but Secretary of Clinton having been a Secretary of State, being a U.S. Senator, being a former First Lady and a former First Lady of Arkansas, you know, to have even their daughter Chelsea be involved in the foundation, be involved in the Clinton Global Initiative. So when you look at them as your role models, and feel free to talk about other role models whom you've emulated or looked up to, but do they feel, and do you feel that although the 90s are decades in the past now, that President Clinton is hopeful and Secretary Clinton is hopeful and Chelsea is hopeful that we can get back to a time where it was, President Clinton working with Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, or even a decade earlier when it was President Reagan working with Tip O'Neill. Even despite the Make America Great Again movement, do the Clintons feel that we can get back to a place where there is less division? In this generation, is there less division? And how much of the Clinton Global Initiative and how much of the Clinton Foundation can really help solve that division through relationship building, through leadership building, through connecting peoples from all walks of life in their foundational work, helping 500 million people around the world through the hundreds of commitments? What do the Clintons feel or believe, and from your perspective, to help us get back to a better place so we don't have any loss of progress in this part of the 21st century?
Yeah. Let me start there and then I'll go back to influences. Clearly, as leaders, we, myself, my colleagues, friends, have been inspired by them and admire their leadership and take those lessons. And then in turn, I think all of us were influenced by the people between them and us when we were young. I mean, many of us started, in our early 20s on the 92 and 96 campaign, myself on the 96 campaign. And so the people who'd been around, who'd been in more, who were in more senior jobs, who also distilled their leadership style into the day-to-day work experience that we had, were incredibly influential. And it all came from the top. It all came from the leadership and approach that the president and the secretary exhibited. And the foundation, I think they certainly are optimistic and believe that, as President famously said in one of his inaugurals, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be cured by what's right with America. And the best thing that we can do is show examples. Show an example on a big stage about what partnership and progress look like when you work together, and then in smaller, in communities and for individuals, show how there are people who care about them and care about everybody and are working together to try to, you know, deliver clean water in Flint, Michigan, or quality childcare in Maine, or work on the climate crisis in Tennessee, or help LA recover from the fires, or all the mobilization that had been done through the years to recover from hurricanes like Irma and Maria in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and the Caribbean region. During the pandemic, this is a great example. We have the Clinton Presidential Center in Little Rock, and people tend to think of the presidential centers as museums, when really, particularly the modern ones, are vibrant educational and economic engines for their communities. And during the pandemic, when so many school kids weren't able to get meals because their schools were shut down, the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Presidential Center partnered with Jose Andres and World Central Kitchen, and the Clinton Center became a distribution point for 1 million meals for school kids who otherwise wouldn't get them in that community. And they didn't care. They didn't say, "Are you a registered Democrat or Republican? Are your parents a registered Democrat?" It's really about what serves the community. We have, a lot of the work of the foundation has been driven by their experience in not only as leaders, and in certain cases, there are things that the president felt like he wanted to continue working on after office, including our HIV and AIDS work. There are other things that touched him personally after office that he thought he could turn something potentially tragic into a positive. And so, he's talked about this quite often, but in 2004, he had a heart attack, and thankfully he recovered fine. And the American Heart Association came to him and said, why don't we do something together to encourage people to eat healthier, to be healthier, to help American school kids have healthier food options. And so the Alliance for a Healthier Generation was born. And some of the signature work was to get all of the major snack and beverage food companies, Coke, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, Snapple, to work together to reduce the calories available in schools. And that meant getting them to voluntarily take very popular products like Coke and Pepsi out of schools and replace them with lower calorie and healthier options. And that's something the foundation did by getting, non-traditional or competitors to work together for the greater good. We also have a program, one of President Clinton's dear friends' son died of an opioid overdose when he didn't know, it was a really tragic accident, and could be stem both to the need for more education about the opioid epidemic, but having schools and first responders and houses of worship and other places have access to naloxone and Narcan, so that if someone does have an overdose, and those are many places that people do, that they can immediately get the antidote and save a lot of lives. And so he set about having the foundation work with the manufacturers to make this available all over the country, all over schools. We have a tremendous program with faith leaders in a lot of rural communities and states that the perception may be they would be not welcoming of the Clinton Foundation just based on the name. And in fact, when you get down to the community level, they welcome the participation that help to make their communities healthier, safer, and save lives. And so so much of the work is just built on we have so many things in common, whether it's love of family or friends, trying to work hard and make a better way for yourselves and make a better way for the community. And so through all of those examples, they are both in practice and principle ways the Clintons are using the foundation to show both what's possible, but also not wait around. There are problems that need to be dealt with right now that are very tangible, and they put the foundation and all the people that gravitate to the foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative in a room to figure out what those solutions could be.
Yes, and both the foundation and the initiative, I mean, they're tremendous assets to this country and to the world. And it's all about not only making positive impacts here in the United States, but around the world, and having younger people get involved, and what can be done at the grassroots level, even despite both organizations that are well established and well known throughout the world, that you never stop trying to find younger people to get them engaged in civic duty, to know what it's like to be involved in their communities and be leaders in their communities, and being good stewards, right? And knowing a lot about our history, where we come from, who we are, and what opportunities there are in the future for us to continue promoting, whether freedom of speech, promoting democratic norms and values, family values, and at the same time civil discussions that should be happening between Democrats and Republicans, as well as independents too. And so what are you most prideful of, as well, of the work that you're doing today with the Clinton Global Initiative and the Clinton Foundation? Because I know that being the executive producer of Why Am I Telling You This with President Clinton, would love to know more about your show that you produce for President Clinton. You're the founder and president of Minassian Media. You've been a visiting fellow of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service. You're a member on the Council on Foreign Relations. You're also a member of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. You talk about your work with HBO. You're even involved with the FIFA World Cup USA in 1994, when you first started out as a regional manager of the Legacy Tour of 94, which this is a sports podcast as well. So I'd love for you to talk about your sports, influence with the FIFA World Cup. But in all of the organizations that you've worked for, that you've been a part of, whether you were working primarily directly with the Clintons and then even your time away, how do we get younger people involved? How do we get younger people to understand relationship building at its finest? Because I always say that relationship building is the essence of humanity. And it really is, because without relationship building, if you look back thousands of years of, nation building and diplomacy, and yes, tragically, there have been a lot of wars fought and lost, but it showed where we were on the spectrum of human civilization, to where once America came along, I mean, we've had our dominance now for nearly 250 years, but really it wasn't until the 20th century then really we surpassed England and we became the ultimate superpower, and we stayed a superpower by winning World War I and World War II, and we didn't allow division to happen in our country to an extent where we were allowed to then, have a successful civil rights movement. And because the civil rights were where all people are now afforded, the same rights and liberties, and, nothing deters anyone to be able to live out the American dream. But now we feel that the American dream is slipping away. And we've been feeling that way probably for the last 2.5 decades, since the Clinton administration, ended its term, and the George W. Bush years had to preside over 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And, we saw what natural disasters can happen with Hurricane Katrina. We saw with the Great Recession, the deregulation, economic policies, and really the Bush administration allowing Wall Street to have more flexibility and less limitations. And then, then the Obama years had to then get us out of the Great Recession, just like the Biden years had to help us get out of the COVID pandemic. So I just feel that, how do we get young people engaged in understanding the history of our country, especially in modern times? How do younger people put the Clinton administration, those years, into perspective, where it was unparalleled job creation, unparalleled diplomacy, Democrats being able to work with Republicans, and and I love that quote that you had mentioned earlier, because I have a President Clinton coin that has the same quote, and I have it in my office on my shelf. I love that quote from President Clinton. I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's true, what President Clinton said, that you can cure what's wrong with America with what's right with America. It is so true that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We actually have what's in us. We actually have all the resources possible. It's just a matter of, are we willing to access those resources? Are we willing to think outside the box? Are we willing to lend a helping hand? Are we willing to put in the work? And I love when President Biden says that there's nothing beyond our capacity in the United
Yeah.
States if we do it together. And I would love to get your thoughts about what everything I said.
Well, thank you. There were two things. I want to mention two programs at the foundation that I think answer this, and then talk a little bit about communication strategy, because at the core of your question is, how do you reach young people? So we have a program called the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. This is the 10th anniversary. It is a remarkable program. It is in partnership with President Bush's foundation, his father, President George Herbert Walker Bush's foundation, and the Lyndon Johnson Foundation. And it brings a group of 60 fellows together every spring from all walks of life, mid-career mostly, but it's everyone from school teachers to military officers. And they participate in sessions where they go to each of the presidential centers, and they hear case studies about decisions from the different administrations, what worked, what didn't work, how does history look at it, what were the approaches, what were, you know, the leadership lessons from a bipartisan group of people who lived through them. And they also work on their own projects similar to what we do at the Clinton Global Initiative, and work on them together. And this group has brought together people who may never have intersected professionally. Certainly there are, doctors and military officers and others who interact in their communities, but often those many sectors are sort of in their own sector. And so by bringing them together across, perceived party lines, and I say perceived because it really isn't an ideological thing. And there are some people who find out about it from the Bush Center and they may be, drawn to it because of President Bush's involvement. And there are people who find out about it through the Clinton Foundation, maybe drawn to it through Clinton Foundation's work. But then they're in a room together and they really get to know each other. And this alumni group is, as I've been part of some incredible alumni groups from the University of Miami and Georgetown and HBO, the White House and others. This is a really active, engaged group that has stayed in touch and cares about each other and works together and calls on each other for, there was a fellow in the program who was a film director, had a particularly interesting need on a production where they drew on other people from outside the film community who were in this group, from medical experts on COVID to leadership experts to help advance the idea of servant leadership to really run a set in a new way. And those are incredible stories. And I bring that up because the more people that engage in those, the more people that hear those stories, again, they see that progress and working together is possible despite, what the algorithms may tell you on your favorite social media channels. We have another program called Too Small to Fail, which is very much born from Secretary Clinton and Chelsea's belief that getting kids, particularly ages 0 to 5, off to a great start will have lifelong benefits. And the original work around it showed that there was a huge word gap between families that were reading and talking and singing to their kids and ones that weren't. And so trying to close that word gap was a incredible predictor of academic and career success throughout life. And so, some of our initiatives carry the Clinton name. That one doesn't, because we also wanted to make sure that it was getting to, first and foremost, people understood that this was about kids and what we could do to support parents with kids. And we partnered with Hollywood and a number of corporations and states, and it's been a phenomenally successful program. To your question about young people, I think it's a little bit of an overused but true term to meet them where they are. And so you can't not think of smart strategies to get content into people's hands that show them as a very positive worldview. I was giving a talk at the University of Miami a couple of years ago, and a couple of students came up to me and asked me what I thought about how America was portrayed in Grand Theft Auto. And it's not something I'd thought about. And, because of the nature of the game, it shows decay in American cities. And so you have young people who are playing the game. They're not particularly playing the game because they're interested in a socioeconomic or political message, but nonetheless, when they see cities in the backdrop that are crumbling because it fits the narrative of the game, and then in real life, when they hear people say the cities are crumbling, then it's not new information, it's reinforcing something they've gotten through something that they were playing for entertainment. And so when you think about how to show young people that there's a history we should be aware of, there are opportunities to serve, there's an importance in your community, how you tell that story, so to speak, in places where they want to consume things, you have a better chance at reaching them. And, President Clinton, you mentioned this podcast, and Chelsea has a wonderful new podcast called That Can't Be True, where she works with experts to debunk misinformation, particularly around health, that people are hearing on all of their channels. And so she's done a tremendous job about saying, okay, well, people are listening to podcasts and YouTube and other places to get information, sadly, sometimes misinformation. So let's go there. Let's do something on those platforms that gives the other side of the story. And President Clinton's podcast was very much built on how he talks about growing up and understanding that everybody has a story, and that another mission in your work in public service or through foundation work is to help people live better life stories. And he always talks about how, he didn't have a television till he was 10, and their entertainment growing up in rural Arkansas was to sit around the table and tell stories, but that importantly, he couldn't tell a story until he was able to prove to his family that he could listen and learn the stories of other people. And so that ability to see somebody by understanding them and their stories and humanize them by finding common ground in experiences that they've had together has driven our work, and I think is the way you get young people involved. Because look, I mean, we remember MTV. We were talking about the '90s, how powerful that was. That ability to reach young people hasn't gone away. The medium has shifted. Obviously, short form video, audio, social media, smart ways to do something that is interesting and compelling around these ideas at least I think our best chance to engage young people in the way that you're describing.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you saying all of this. And as you were discussing the two programs that you point out that you're really proud of, I don't know if you know this, but I just realized because it jogged my memory. But one of my previous guests, Dr. Anida Dua, was the 2023 Presidential Leadership Scholar. And, I love that you brought up that program. And I'm going to be speaking with her again later this week. And, just for my audience at
Yeah.
home who have caught her interview, she's a vascular surgeon, associate professor of surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's also associate professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School. But I love the fact that we can draw that connection because you talk about the Presidential Leadership Scholar, and she was one of them back in 2023. And I'm happy to connect you with her if you're interested to speak with her
Oh,
further.
no, no, we know each other. She's tremendous. But I would bet if you talk to her again and you ask her, who is the most unlikely person, putting aside President Bush, President Clinton, that she met among her group of fellows in the program, she would probably have a really interesting and surprising answer. I don't know who she would answer, but I suspect it's someone that she would have largely maybe never run across, certainly probably not had spent the quality time to understand them and what motivates them and their own story and why they were drawn to a public service program the same way that she was.
Yes, no, I will be speaking with her on this upcoming Friday. I'd already interviewed her from a few weeks ago, but she's going to help me promote our interview to her professional circles at Massachusetts General Hospital as well as Harvard University. And we were, I like to engage with my guests offline as well. Anytime I could collaborate with my guests, or if there's a need or specific opportunities, I'm always open to that. But separately, this podcast allows me to speak with great influential people like you, Craig, and especially the fact that, talking offline, my other guests who have been on my podcast, Chuck Todd, who's a big Miami Hurricanes fan, although he went to George Washington University. He grew up in Miami. I grew up in Tampa, Florida, although originally from the Northeast, the New York metropolitan area, born in New Jersey, but I grew up in Tampa, and I am a UNC Chapel Hill graduate. So there's the Atlantic Coast Conference for you. And I saw that you're a University of Miami graduate as well. But the fact that people like Peter Selfridge or Adrian Elrod, and Adrian works with Rufus Gifford, and they both have the Elrod Gifford group that they started. But they're people who have worked with the Clintons. They are people who have worked with the Obamas, people who have worked with the Bidens, directly or indirectly. It's the Democratic Party is, as Adrian liked to say, it's like an umbrella party. You tend to have a broad coalition, right? And we even saw that last year with Vice President Harris when she was running her 107-day campaign. You saw moderate Republicans join with Democrats alike to try to get the message out. And although that Vice President Harris didn't win the election last year, still over 75 million people voted for her. And she shares the same distinction with Secretary Clinton as the two females in two of the last three election cycles who have been the Democratic nominee for president. And so knowing where not only young people, but young women, for the audience at home, to see people like Kamala Harris, to see people like Hillary Clinton, how much has that empowered a lot of young women to want to reach the heights that they've seen Secretary Clinton and Vice President Harris have reached? And I can go back to a conversation that I saw with President Ford on YouTube. I was watching the other day, and he talked about how he believed, and this is his post presidency, it was a conversation from the late 80s. He felt that America was destined for the first female president. So, knowing that the Clinton Global Initiative, the Clinton Foundation, encompasses the work for people from all walks of life who have contributed to these organizations and have had so much great influential presence around the world, how much is female empowerment important, being that Secretary Clinton has probably inspired so many young women? And then also, you talked about the birth of the internet, where it was more on a public scale. Not to say that, I mean, the internet had existed pre Bill Clinton years, but it was where it was able to be reached from all parts of the world under his administration. So knowing that with social media and now with all these other new platforms like TikTok, and then having to deal with misinformation and disinformation, especially during the Trump years, and not having all the time in the world to fact check, and even for the most skilled journalists and people who have significant media careers like you and me, like it's not enough in a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week news cycle where we can fact check everything in real time. And I think that even for people who are considered to be the lay people who may not understand how media works and how people are able to, consume media in such high volume, that also that consequentially can affect elections too, because they may not have the information that they need today, or for, leading up to an election where they're able to vote where they fully understand facts and figures. People are going to vote with their feelings, not necessarily with facts and figures, if it doesn't justify their feelings or how they, go about their daily lives. But just again, further discussing the misinformation, disinformation. I love the fact that Chelsea Clinton, the former first daughter of Bill and Hillary Clinton, but who is really tackling that, and how we can really get to a place where we have, young women who can be inspired by the work of Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Well, this is the 30th anniversary of Secretary Clinton's famous and incredibly important speech at the UN's Conference on Women in Beijing, where she said women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, and you can't separate those out. And we've now seen generations of young people, generations of leaders in other countries. I mean, there've been a record number of women who've led their country since then, long overdue here, but we'll get there. And you do see, at least what we see through our work, is a tremendous enthusiasm from young women who really gravitate to the secretary and the former vice president, and so many women who've been role models in business, in government, in civil society, to show what's possible. I mean, it's a radical, radical change from, maybe the first 50 years of this century, where opportunities were often limited. And we owe a tremendous amount of credit to leaders like Secretary Clinton, who really tried to push through, in her words, the put 18 million cracks in the glass ceilings. And I also think, we, you talked about division before, and we also have to be careful as communicators that we're not inadvertently creating more division by, whether it's through whatever lens we choose, because encouraging young men to be active in civil society too is just as important. And so, and there are a number of studies now that show that maybe young men are at a point where they feel more disengaged and frustrated than they've ever been, and that they're feeling the way that they feel, they probably have good reason to feel that way. And so, what we can do through the foundation and other civil society organizations is make sure that we're being inclusive about what our programs do and what the solutions are, and give everybody a chance to see themselves in the work. And that's certainly what the Clintons have tried to do. It also, at least in my own approach, and something the Clintons have very much embraced, is, I've learned a lot from the other aspects of my career. Certainly HBO, and particularly when Richard Plepler was leading the organization, and a mentor of mine, reminding us that audiences and customers, they're voting literally every month when they at that time, pay their cable bill. And so trying to be relevant to them was critical, having a lot of respect and having a relationship with them, and having programming that spoke to them, that they aspirationally saw themselves in. Sure, some programming is fun. And I think we also have to be careful about not forgetting that the entertainment business is entertainment first, or it doesn't work. But that said, people want to see themselves in characters and storylines and narratives, at least to a certain degree. Maybe also with superhero and Marvel movies, we all want to see ourselves as a superhero, or vanquish the bad guy. But the idea that storytelling is such a powerful force in building community and an audience, and that's something in the approach of HBO but I talk about a lot. When we're trying to get people to care about an issue, let's say climate change, for example, the same narrative devices that propel great storytelling, characters that you care about, conflict, and that could be the race against time with climate change, stakes that you understand in a ticking clock are typically found in really good storytelling Hollywood narratives. If you apply that to the kind of issues that we're working on, you have a better chance of engaging people and, using that strategy across whatever platform we're trying to engage people on. And then you take the World Cup and, one thing I didn't fully appreciate until I had the chance to work on the organizing committee is how much soccer was really an international language that breaks down any barrier. I mean, people, certainly have strong rooting interest for their national teams, but those national teams are bringing each other in contact with other people in other countries and other cultures. Everybody can appreciate a dramatic win, a heartbreaking loss, and we, tell our daughters who play soccer that you're really learning a language. You could go anywhere in the world and have something in common with the people you've never met because of soccer. And that is a really powerful thing and the starting point for building relationships because everybody does have something in common. And I think to several questions about division, it's because perhaps we're being told X does not have something in common with Y, or, you know, so and so doesn't understand where you're coming from, which isn't the case. Everybody has something in common. And I think as communicators, our job is to find those starting points of connections. It can be a way that we overcome the division that, again, that you were asking about.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you discussing all this. I mean, you touch upon several topics. One, yes, helping women, young women, is so important, and equally important is helping young men too. And I'm going to be interviewing this Friday the Lieutenant Governor of California 2026 candidate Josh Friday, who's also the Chief Service Officer in Governor Gavin Newsom's administration in California. He specifically works in the Office of Service and Community Engagement, and they have this entity called California Volunteers, and their goal is to have 10,000 young men get involved in civic life, civic duty, learning to be mentors, learning to be tutors, getting involved in their communities, and being, mentored through this program where they don't feel left out, where they don't feel left behind. And it speaks to what you're talking about, Craig. It speaks to even the public comments that Scott Galloway or a Michael Smerconish have talked about. And I'm a firm believer in that. And I'm going to have a separate conversation outside of my podcast with Director Friday, Josh Friday, about how I can collaborate with Governor Newsom's administration. I have that call scheduled for next week, but that also for us to have a conversation offline, however I could be of assistance to the Clinton Global Initiative or the Clinton Foundation. I would love to have that conversation with you. But it's interesting because my sister has met President Clinton. She worked on Avenue of Americas at the New York City Hilton, and she was in hospitality and catering events, and she greeted President Clinton. He had I think, a conference, or had a speaking engagement.
That's our host hotel for the Clinton Global Initiative. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so when my sister worked at the Hilton Hotel 15 years ago, she was there for 4 years. She had greeted President Clinton and she had opened the door for him. She was so happy to see him and he was so gracious. And it was just a brief exchange. But given that, yes, it must have been for the Clinton Global Initiative. And so she had that interaction with him, which she reminds us in the family, proud Armenian family like yours, that she met Bill Gates and she's met a lot of other notable figures who had come through that hotel at one time or another for speaking engagements or conferences and whatnot. So that's so wonderful. And my sister can relate to, what President Clinton had to go through when he had his heart attack. And unfortunately, our Armenian uncle, he passed away from a heart attack. And, there are heart issues that are on our side of the family. My sister is a 2-time open heart surgery survivor. And, that's just something in common where you could relate to anybody from the president of the United States to your next door neighbor or whomever is in your close circle of friends who have had heart-related issues. Her boss, she works on Park Avenue. Her boss has had some heart-related issues as well. So it's just unbelievable how something like the heart could affect so many people. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I met former Second Lady of the United States, Lynn Cheney, Dick Cheney's wife, and her husband, former vice president, they had a program establishing heart defibrillators through a program with George Washington University and making sure that they were accessible on campus and throughout DC. So it's interesting, you talking about these very important critical issues that pertain to the president, his health. And I know that he's done a phenomenal, remarkable job as he's gone through life. And, he is, thank God, he survived that health scare back in 2004 and that he's thriving today. And he and Secretary Clinton can do so much with the foundation and pass that on down to Chelsea one day and the legacy that she's involved with. And you talk about her podcast, which again, we really need to get a handle on misinformation, disinformation, because we have seen a lot out of that from the first and second Trump administrations. So I do hope that we get to a better place. And want to talk also about your role currently with the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative as a chief marketing officer who focuses on the content and the communication of both entities, how integral your role is and the roles are for the success of the organization. And then we could talk about final words of relationship building that you'd like to impart on my audience.
Well, look, I mean, our work is driven by the people who participate, particularly all of the organizations, the leaders from the corporate sector, government sector through the years, nonprofit sector who come together at CGI and really put their ideas into action. So our job, my job, is to make sure that that story is getting out, that their good work is acknowledged, and people can find a way into it. Our incredible CGI team developing these commitments and in the program. So it really is a team effort. Our goal is to help people understand things better. One thing we learned and I've talked about this a number of times. One thing we learned in 2016 is that there was a broad misunderstanding of the philanthropic sector, not just what the Clinton Foundation does. And we certainly had people out there who were deliberately trying to get people to think about the Clinton Foundation a particular way. But for such a huge segment of society, there are, in any given year, about 10% of the US workforce is in the nonprofit sector. And maybe the most misunderstood sector because they're grant making organizations, there are operating foundations, such as the Clinton Foundation. There are local organizations, there are national ones, there are regional ones, there are international ones, and they all operate with the same, broad goal is they are trying to address problems in society. How they do it, where they do it, why they do it varies, quite a bit from organization to organization. So, there are plenty of people who pick your big name organization. You can ask them on the street, have you heard of X Foundation? They probably say yes. And you might say, well, what do they do? Maybe they have a top line understanding, probably not more than I, certainly not how it works in an ecosystem together. I Harkening back a little bit to the my days at HBO, Gary Trudeau used to talk about how late night shows and the Tonight Show, writers could make a joke on a headline, maybe the subhead, never the body of the story. And that is something, again, a different lesson from a different part of my experience that we try to bring to bear when we're trying to communicate the work of the Clinton Foundation. We know that people have maybe a top line understanding or they know who the Clintons are. Hopefully they feel like they're doing good things, but then it's our job to fill in the blanks to get them to see how they fit into that picture and how they could participate and how they could, also be a catalyst for making their own communities, improve and address problems that they see there. And that's really philanthropy at its best when someone says, you know what, I see something in the world around me that I want to make better. And for years, a good example of that, and to circle back to your question about young people, we had a college version of the Clinton Global Initiative called Clinton Global Initiative University, and where young people from around the world in colleges and universities would say, I see something in my community that could be better. And there's not a business objective. There's not a, they were very young. They full of optimism and idealism. And some of the programs that these young people started, through the Clinton Foundation are remarkable. There's a young man We started a program that was a CGIU commitment called Sproxel. His ideas, he saw in the developing world that it was very difficult for a patient to distinguish between a counterfeit medication and a real one. And so he came up with a way that was a text-based way for you to pick a number that was on, a pill, and very quickly text to a central database and get a response whether that was real or not. And just by doing that simple intervention and getting the companies to go along with him stamping a number on their drugs, the efficacy rate went way up because people knew that they were taking a legitimate treatment. That was something that he just saw in his community as a need and had an ingenious way to do it. There were other students. There was a young woman, actually, this became a pretty well-known commercial for Best Buy, where she saw that she could make a rechargeable battery out of a soccer ball. And by kids kicking around the soccer ball, it charged the battery. And then they could use it for any manner of things. Could be a laptop, could be a water filtration system, could be a reading light, where otherwise electricity was hard to deliver in really rural communities in different parts of the world. That came from the energy and ideas of young people. And so those are the stories that, if we're doing our job well, we try to tell, and hopefully, shows the progress as possible and shows that everybody can be a catalyst for that progress, whatever age, whatever experience they have.
Yes, and I believe that, and you speak so fondly of all your experiences, but it seems to me that specifically with HBO, what a unique involvement you had in the leadership positions you had there, where it kind of was the middle part of your career, while before and after you have worked with the Clintons, but that your time with HBO from a media perspective or from an outreach perspective or from a just understanding how Americans think or understand how they process and interpret comedy or how they interpret gaming or how they interpret entertainment, because you reference Grand Theft Auto and how maybe not from a politically conscious standpoint, but that their views as younger people who played that game, where they see American cities in a different light. But again, there have been controversies of, Grand Theft Auto in terms of, does it promote violence? Does it warp
Sure.
young people's minds? And, I remember even how controversial it was for that game to be sold at Best Buy or other places. But that's a conversation neither here nor there if you want to share your thoughts on Grand Theft Auto, because I know that, there's so much that we've covered and I really appreciate it. And I know that we're fellow Armenians, and I've had other Armenians on my podcast, Ken Kachigian, who worked for President Reagan and President Nixon. I've had Tim Kirkchin of ESPN. And so you are my third Armenian guest on my podcast. So would love for you to talk about what family means to you, your Armenian heritage and culture that we share. And I love how you talk about how your daughters love soccer and played soccer. I was just in Southern California for my cousin's Armenian wedding in Glendale. And my other cousins, they grew up playing soccer. So I know that soccer and chess and other sports are so big in our culture, but would love for you to share about what family means to you and then our Armenian culture.
Oh, family. Thank you for that question. Family is everything. And we're proud to be Armenian, very proud to meet and be able to work with you and other fellow Armenians. Look, we talked about HBO a lot, HBO family, the Clinton family. You hope that you find families in your different parts of your professional career or things that feel like families. And that as a leader, we try to create an environment where, people feel like they belong. And I think for me, so much of that desire comes from a family and a community where I felt like I belonged. And not only because we're born into it, but the way our parents, our community, and our aunts and uncles and the greater community respond. And perhaps that's because we're a small people as peoples go, and certainly have been through some of the hardest times an ethnic group can go through. But there's not a time that someone says, "Oh, I see that you're Armenian and I would love to connect. I'd love to talk. I'd love to, get messages from all over the world from people who are, they're finding me on LinkedIn or some other platform because of what I do, but what they're responding to or why they want to connect is who we are. And that is just an incredible source of pride and community that I draw from my Armenian heritage. And, very proud to go around the world on behalf of the US government and the Clintons, and always feel like I'm representing more than just our country here, but Armenian and Armenian people and my family. And that, gives me a tremendous amount of pride and satisfaction.
Absolutely. And that's wonderful words that you could share about our Armenian heritage. And, it really means a lot to be an Armenian, and that we're the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion. And St. Thaddeus and St. Bartholomew were the two saints who preached Christianity to the Armenians. And, our country is founded on Judeo-Christian values, but at the same time, we welcome people of all walks of life, all religions, all ethnicities, people who have goals, dreams, and aspirations that they want to pursue and that they want to live out the American dream. And that's why it's so important that no matter who you are and no matter where you come from, no matter how you grew up, or no matter what your interests are, of all aspects, that you can make it in America and that you have a place here, you have a home here. And whether you're native to our country or not, and you come here as immigrants, because as you know very well, we're descendants of the Armenian genocide. And, when my mom and her parents and her two brothers came to America in 1956, they emigrated from Jordan, but at one time they lived in Palestine. And when Israel became a state, they had to leave Palestine and they came to Jordan. And then from Jordan, they came to America. And what we saw just yesterday with the hostages being released, Palestinian hostages, the Israeli hostages, that we hope that peace in the Middle East can finally be realized, and that, this is a pathway forward. And I'm sure the Clintons, and I'm sure the work that you do with the Clintons, that from a communication standpoint, from an outreach standpoint, from an impact standpoint, being able to utilize relationship building in all corners of the globe, and whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in South America, whether it's in the Asian Pacific countries, every part of the world, here, even in North America, and our relationship with Mexico to the south and Canada to the north, that we are able to, as people, get to a better place in life, where this division, not just here in our country, but division around the globe, and that we don't see the rise of authoritarianism, in this country. And because President Trump's administration is the closest thing that we've seen to an authoritarian type of regime, and that whether it's President Clinton, Secretary Clinton, President Obama, President Biden, Vice President Harris, that the Democrats who have held the top one or two positions in our country, or having served in a very top cabinet position like Secretary Clinton, that we can have a Democratic coalition be able to embrace Republicans as well. And that if there is a Republican coalition that wants to have their opinions and beliefs, and to go back to that traditional two-party system, that the Make America Great Again movement won't be a movement in the future that will continue to impede on even what Republican traditional, or when I say traditional, but what Republican ideals have been going back to Dwight D. Eisenhower's time, so that we can get back to a time when President Clinton had the ability to work with Democrats and Republicans, and to be able to, put forth ideas that were, discussed and legislated, to where important piece of legislation, even in the Clinton years, with the assault weapons ban, with the ability to make attempts to, reform everything from our criminal justice system, everything from, making sure that immigrants can come to America and have a place here, whether it's, having strong bilateral agreements with Mexico or Canada. And although NAFTA is no longer what it was when President Clinton, his leadership, created NAFTA, that we can get back to a place where trade is not, seen as a detriment, that we can still have healthy trade with countries around the world, where it's not seen as now we have to, under the Trump administration, with these global tariffs that are very much curtailing American dominance and suppressing us to be a regional superpower instead of a global superpower. And a federal judge in recent months has said that the tariffs that the Trump administration put forth was unconstitutional. Most of those tariffs put in place was unconstitutional. So I know how much trade mattered in the Clinton years as well as the Obama and Biden years. So I really do hope that we get into a place economically, spiritually, environmentally, in the sense of, getting back to prioritizing great education, great healthcare, cancer research, and that public funding is not pulled, whether it's PBS, NPR. You being a media guy like me and having worked at HBO, me having worked at ESPN, NBC Universal, how much the media matters, and especially public broadcasting and any type of nonpartisan media. We need that in society. We need that for our children. We need that for the progression of young people to understand the importance of education, to be understanding the importance of our history and where we come from. So I do hope that we get to a better place, Craig.
I think that's something we can all agree on.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being with me today on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about the work of the Clinton Foundation, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to continuing the conversation as well, Craig. And I do hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless and take care.
Thank you. Thank you.